You added a reference to the mailmodule.dll class library in Lesson 1.2. You then saw that the IntelliSense menu provides useful information about the methods and properties of the class library. This was only possible because I created an XML documentation file to accompany the mail module class library. But this doesn't happen by default. Without an XML documentation file, none of the XML summary information would have been displayed in the IntelliSense menu. When you create a class library, you should always include summary information for every property and method, along with an accompanying XML documentation file. This will make it easier for programmers to use the class library. Adding summaries to methods and properties was covered in Session 7 of the Essential Skills course in this series. You will create a class library of your own in Lesson 4.4. You'll rarely find it useful to inspect the contents of an XML documentation file, but you'll manually examine one in this lesson to understand how it works. To begin, open the JOSBAR web application project from your sample files folder. And view the properties of the project by right-clicking on JOSBAR web application in the Solution Explorer and clicking Properties. Now you're going to change the build options of the project to generate an XML documentation file. Click the Build tab, then scroll down to the Output group and click XML documentation file. Whenever the project is built, an XML documentation file will now be created in the bin folder. Build the project now by right-clicking on JOSBAR web application in the Solution Explorer and clicking Build. Now that you've built the project, an XML documentation file has been generated. Open the file now by clicking File, Open File, then navigate to the JOSBAR web application folder if it isn't open already, then open the bin folder, click JOSBAR web application.dll and click Open. The XML documentation file opens in Visual Studio. Many other programs are capable of opening XML files, but opening the file with Visual Studio will ensure that you see the same thing that is shown in this video. XML isn't actually a specific programming language. It's really a standard for storing information. For example, HTML code is a form of XML. XML always works as a series of nested tags enclosed in less than and greater than symbols, which open and close in the same way as HTML tags. XML documentation files use different tags to HTML, but basically work in the same way. Because XML can be used to store any kind of data in a hierarchy, it's an extremely versatile way to store data. XML is covered in greater depth in Session 3 of the Essential Skills course in this series. You'll learn how to use C# code to manipulate XML data in Lesson 10.9. Now let's examine the XML file. First, you'll see a tag called Assembly, which contains the name of the project's base class. The base class is the class that contains all of the other classes in a project. Next, you'll see a Members tag. This tag contains separate member tags for every class, property, and method in the project, including any ASP.NET controls. One of the first member tags contains the text box email address control on the default.aspx page. You can tell that this control is on the default.aspx page by looking at the name property. The full path to the control is default.textboxEmailAddress. In the Essential Skills course in this series, you learned that each ASPX page has an underlying class. Visual Studio's compiler sees the default.aspx page as the _default class. Note that if you rename a page without renaming its underlying class, the page's class name may no longer match its file name. For this reason, it is best to avoid renaming ASPX pages if possible. Finally, you're going to open the mailmodule.xml file. This is the XML documentation file that accompanies the mailmodule.dll class library. Click File, Open File, mailmodule.xml, and click Open. This XML documentation file provides the IntelliSense information for the Mail Module class library. You examined this information in the IntelliSense menu in Lesson 1-2. Close Visual Studio now. And you've now completed Lesson 1-8. Create an XML documentation file.